Hello and welcome to Unprofessional Engineering. My name is James.
And you got Luke.
Luke, today we're going into something that's just an amazing topic. The engineering behind baking. Or as Luke calls it, I'm into baking sourdough this week, so let's make it a topic. What do you say?
Okay, so first of all, I think everybody probably knows we're in the middle of a pandemic, or at least when we're recording this we were. Maybe you don't hear it now.
Maybe not the middle.
But apparently that's what everybody does. Everybody decides to bake, because you're all stuck at home. You got some extra time. So yeah, I started about 2.5 months ago, baking sourdough bread, and I'm not tooting my own horn, James, but I make a mean sourdough bread. Just put it out there.
I would like to try your sourdough sometime when it wouldn't infect me with awful viruses or diseases.
I know.
Or
the other thing too that we've made a loaf of banana bread like every 3 days.
All I heard for like the first month of the pandemic was everybody's making banana bread, and I never saw anything about that. Like, people would tell me that on meetings and stuff, but I never saw, like, social media posts about it. I didn't make any banana bread.
Oh, I made so much banana bread.
Do you make banana nut bread or banana bread?
My family doesn't like the walnuts, so it's been just straight up banana bread. So
okay, Luke. So, can I start, or do you want to? Because I know you're just really passionate about this.
You can start, because I got so much stuff here that it's going to be too much for the show, so I'm going to have to pepper it in.
Okay, you pepper it in. So I'm going to start off with when you're mixing your ingredients, you're actually doing chemical reactions. So all of you naysayers out there who's like, this isn't even engineering, which I've gotten a couple of those on the Facebooks
I know,
lately.
I saw that. Jerks.
Yeah, jerks. You don't have to listen to us, that's fine. I mean, we're rich and famous already. Anyways, you're doing a chemical reaction. This is what's happening with your ingredients. And not just basically, you are doing a chemical reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Each item in your baking materials has a specific job that it's going to be playing. Some of them are just to make stuff delicious, which I love those ingredients, but other ones also have to do with the feel of what you're baking, the textures, everything. And the order that they touch each other actually is really important as well. And so I've been baking for a while now, I would say. And I understand that, you can't have these ingredients touch each other, and you have to mix your dry ingredients before they get wet and all this stuff. But I never really understood why. But as we go through this, we're going to get into more details. So just as a super high level, and we're going to get into more detail, flour gives your confection a lot of structure. The baking powder or baking soda that you work with is what kind of adds air bubbles to it. So if you want a more airy bread or a more airy cake sort of thing, you might have more baking powder or soda in what you're making. Eggs are kind of like the glue that holds all of this stuff together. Oil and butter is what makes it tender. So, like, I guess if we think about a cookie, there's other things that go into it, like over baking them. Not that I ever do that. But having more oil or butter content in your cookies might make them softer then.
I like to say the word moist.
Oh, that's what milk and water does, Luke. You knew where I was going. It makes them moist. And so with that, I think I need to hand this.
Do you have people in your family that hate the word moist?
I'm one of those people.
Oh, you hate the word moist.
There's 3 words. I like that one more than the other 2, but I can't say the other 2 on air without being uncomfortable. So I'm going to go ahead and let you continue on with this.
So here we go. So we have to talk about flour. So this it's literally the foundation of pretty much all baking. And interestingly,
no, there's flourless recipes, Luke.
Well,
we're
most
talking baking.
Yeah. But flour is actually categorized as any powder made from grinding grains, roots, beans, nuts, or seeds. So, for example, those of you that are gluten-free, you probably do a lot of nut or seeds or those types of flour, so almond flour, cashew flour, coconut flour, those sorts of things. They're good, but they're not regular, what they call cereal flours.
Luke, I have it in here somewhere. Have you ever had gluten-free pizza?
I've made some from scratch multiple times.
Don't you ever tell me that it's good. And any of you listening that are going to lie to me and be like, well, if you get it at this place, it's really
No,
good,
no,
you can
no.
stop listening too.
You know what it does. You know what it does. So I have made cauliflower pizza crust pizza,
I've done that before.
and here's what it does. It tricks you. The first bite, you're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is like the best pizza. It's just like regular pizza. And then like 4 bites later, you're like, this is cauliflower with like cheese and eggs and sauce. This is disgusting. It
Yes.
tricks you that first bite. So
It does. Okay.
Getting back to the show. So
Sorry.
cereal flours is what we're going to talk about. And cereal flours consist of, when you think of the wheat, it consists of the endosperm, the germ, and the bran. That is what's inside of a whole grain flour. So they basically grind the whole thing, and there's some portion of all of those in it. Whenever you have refined flour, so pure white flour, it's called sometimes, it's the endosperm only. So this is the very inner part of the actual, if you look at like a cross section, there's all these different pieces and layers. It's just the endosperm that makes up refined flour.
Would that be refined flour? Would that be the stuff that they're like, oh, that's not good for you? That's like just
White
the leftover
flour.
crap.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
so
okay.
basically, I
What
would
I
say
like. Okay.
the vast majority of flours that are in baked goods is refined, some form of refined white flour.
Like unbleached. Yeah.
Unless it says wheat flour or whole grain or some, then all of the bran and all the other in the germ is actually included. So fun fact, the earliest archaeological evidence of wheat seeds being crushed between simple millstones dates back to all the way to 6000 BC.
Wow.
So some cat, 6000 BC, was like, you know what? This thing that we walk past, this grass, I see cows eating it. Why don't we grind this up and maybe throw a little bit of water in it and like do something with it? And it basically they made bread like 6000 BC.
I know you're old, but the way you recalled that story, it was almost like you were there.
It was. So I'm going to go through this super quick because there's a ton of flours. So this
much.
is So the first one is cake flour. Cake flour has the lowest gluten protein content. It's somewhere around 6 or 7%. And that's why when you have cake flour, cakes kind of crumble apart because it has really low gluten. And gluten is like basically webs of structure that occurs. The next one is pastry flour. This is 7.5 to like 9.5% gluten protein. This makes them flaky more than crumbly, but yet not super chewy like a regular bread dough. All-purpose or plain flour, this is somewhere 9.5 to 11, and this is the stuff that the majority of what you're eating out there is made out of, some type of all-purpose or plain flour. There's different grades. They grind it at different levels to make it silkier or smoother or rougher. But this is basically pizzas, breads, all the things you're eating. Bread flour is, or they call it strong flour over in Europe.
Strong.
This has, like me strong, not you strong. It's called strong flour, and that's because it has a high gluten protein content. It's around 11.5 to 13.5%, and this makes amazing, like, sourdough, really textured bread that's super chewy, super crunchy when you bake it. Then you start getting into things like hard flour. This is where everything's all mixed in, super high gluten protein. There's actual stuff called gluten flour, which is I've never even seen or heard of it before. Self-rising flour is actually regular flour that they actually add baking powder to, and they add salt to it as well. So that is baking powder.
Can I interrupt and talk about gluten for a little bit, Luke?
Oh, I sure hope you talk about gluten because I'm sure we're going to have like tons of haters because my rant is about gluten-free stuff.
Okay, well, that is good. I mean, it isn't, and that should be the that should be the rant. It is not good. But
so what do you know about gluten, James? Anything?
not a whole lot, but basically here's what I know about it. gluten's kind of like what you said. It gives that structure. It makes stuff strong and hold together. So the flour that has low gluten is going to be more crumbly, and the higher gluten flour is going to be much stronger when you're biting into your bread or your dessert or whatever it is. But when you combine your flour and water, it's like everything in there is kind of like this tight, coiled up protein of glutenin, is that about right? And
Yes, you nailed it.
gliadin. And so as you mix these things together and stir them up, it loosens up this connection of everything, and it forms a gluten network. So imagine like this glutenin and this gliadin are like strings together, right? And you have all your strings, and it's kind of like cords. You take your wires and you all bundle them together when you just stuff something in a bag like me. Well, then when you mix all this stuff together, it's a lot more like Luke. You mix them up and they start to release the strings, and these strings end up weaving together in like a nice pattern. And that's what starts giving you this strength of your bread or your baked good. But also, this gluten network then allows for stretching. So as the gases expand in your rising dough as it rises or even as it bakes, this gluten network allows it to maintain its structure, but it also still expands. And so the more protein and the longer mixing time that you have, the stronger your gluten network is going to be. If you have too strong of a gluten network, that's not a good thing. Your dough's not going to rise. You're going to have this really squat loaf, and it's going to have a funny texture to it. If it's too weak, like you didn't mix it enough or you didn't have the right ratios, you're going to have a weak gluten network, and that means your dough is going to collapse. Also not good. That's all I have
So
about it. How about you?
that was actually quite a bit. So, not really a fun fact, but like a personal thing with the gluten is. So I told you I've been making sourdough like it's my job.
Yes, you have.
So to create sourdough super quick, you got to make a sourdough starter. So basically, this is equal parts water and flour. You got to feed this thing over like a couple of days to develop it, and it's basically like a child. You have to take care of it. So I made a sourdough starter. And then I started to make sourdough bread. And the first couple times I made sourdough bread, I never followed the instructions where you have to actually knead it until you can stretch the dough. And it's called a window pane effect, where it becomes transparent and holes don't show up. And I was like, that's close enough. And like my first 3 or 4 loaves, they were good, but they weren't great. And then it's like, okay, I'll knead this until that happens. And in some cases, it depends on the temperature outside, the humidity. There's all kinds of factors that influence this. It got to the point where like I was kneading for like 30 minutes before I would get the window pane effect. But when I proofed that bread and I baked that bread, it was beautiful and bubbly, and it rose up and it didn't fall apart.
You didn't
It was
really
amazing.
need it for 30 minutes, did you? Because
The
after
one
10
day-
minutes, I am like beat.
The one day it was really hot out and I didn't turn the air on yet, and I had to knead it for about 28 minutes because I was timing myself to see what it would be. So it was about 28 minutes before I got the window pane
That's
effect.
outrageous. Yeah, I definitely
kinda
could
crazy.
need it more than I do, but fair enough. Luke, before we move on, I think we're probably due for a word from our sponsor.
King Arthur flour.
Okay, how did you know?
That's my favorite flour.
Is it? Are you a King Arthur snob?
Yeah, they make good stuff.
Yeah, we actually
They are not our sponsor.
they are
I don't
they
think
are
we're
not
allowed to do that
no,
legally.
sorry about that. We do not have a sponsor, but we do have a couple of shout outs. Are you excited?
Let's hear 'em.
Keith,
I am.
Keith T says he just stumbled upon the podcast while on a drive from North Carolina to Maine. So it sounds like he got quite a few episodes under his belt, and we got him hooked. So another sucker in our army of listeners. He has a topic that he suggested to me, but it sounds like an invention that he's been kind of toying around with, so I don't want to throw it out there for someone to steal it. So
Okay.
I'll get back to Keith on that one. And then we have Neil S. who wrote in. He's one of the cool dudes that isn't an engineer, but he is a mechanical designer. So I basically had the conversation that we've had with folks a million times, right? The guys that are engineers are like, no, you have to do it this way. And then you get those plans to the people on the shop floor or wherever, and they're like, this is garbage and we can't manufacture this part. So Neil is that guy that's like kind of the in-between where he's making designs and he's coming up with the right way to do these things. But he's also considering, going back to school to become an industrial engineer. So he was asking if
Ooh.
that was a good idea or not. And so of course I say, of course engineering's a good idea, but really it's kind of a balance for him then. Like, is it worth the time and money? Do you like what you're doing? All that stuff.
Yeah,
So
you got to measure that because I mean, a lot of people go back to school and then they don't necessarily make any more money. Where if they would have just stayed in that career path,
yeah.
they could have. It all depends what your goal is. If it's money, maybe you stay where you're at. If it's kind of some status and some responsibility, then maybe you do it.
Yep. So if any of you have any life-changing questions that you'd like to pose to us, or if you just
For us
want to,
to answer.
yeah, if you'd like us just to talk about some episodes, maybe say hi, maybe get some amazing stickers, why don't you email us at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com?
I think we just became life coaches, James. I can add that to my resume.
Gotta go on LinkedIn and update my old profile,
Life
huh?
coach. I love it.
Yeah.
Make sure that you subscribe, make sure you like, make sure you review, make sure that you share with friends and family. And again, I always say this one, yell at your smart devices to play Unprofessional Engineering Podcast, and you will get the most recent version of the podcast beamed into your ear holes.
Yeah. Fun fact about Alexa, if you tell
Shoot.
her to play us, she does it without a problem. If I tell her, Alexa, play 90s pop, because that's what my wife likes to listen to, she plays Yesterday's Cafe, which you think, okay, maybe that's a 90s pop station.
Nope.
For sure not. It is for sure not. So thanks a lot, Alexa.
Can't be good at everything.
That's right. Okay, moving on. What do you got next, Luke?
Moving on. So I think the next thing we need to talk about is some of the more sciencey things. You did a really good job of describing
Thanks,
what happens
man.
with gluten. But the other thing that you need to think about is what happens with leavening. So leavening is
I don't
what
like that
makes-
word, but go ahead.
Is it better than moist?
Ugh, it is better than moist.
Okay. So leavening. So this is what makes your dough rise, and you basically have four. I'm gonna say five options for leavening, and not a
Wow.
lot of people think about this. So you have steam. So whenever you have a very wet dough and it heats up, so things like eggs and butter, they contain a certain amount of water content, and they can actually steam and make your baked goods rise. You have baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate. And then you also have baking powder. So baking soda is stronger than baking powder. You gotta there's charts for when to use what. Sometimes you use both in some crazy situations. So that's three. I think I said five. It's going to be four. Then you have industrial, or I call purchased yeast. So this is quick rise yeast that you buy at the store in little packages. Sometimes you can buy it fresh and you scoop it off. You got to use it pretty quickly. This stuff is really active and it works really well. And then you have what I created, which is considered a natural yeast, where it's just flour, water. You let the bacteria get into it. It stinks to high heaven for a couple of days.
Yeah.
I threw mine out the first time I did it because I thought something was wrong. And then, I was like, nope, that was right. And then,
Yeah.
when I made it again, 3 days later, it smelled like beautiful sourdough. So those are your four options. And what these do, so they do it a couple different ways. We talked about steam. So baking soda reacts with the acidic ingredients and heat and creates CO2 as a byproduct. And that the CO2 bubbles, basically bubble up, and then your cake or your bread or whatever it is gets all nice and fluffy. Yeast does it a little bit differently. Yeast, whether it's the commercial yeast or the homegrown natural yeast, they actually consume any available sugars that are in your dough. And when your dough is not baking, that's where you get the rise and fall of your dough. So
Right.
This doesn't happen with baking soda. So if you put baking soda in flour, it's not going to necessarily rise. But if you put yeast in flour and you're not cooking it, it'll rise and fall and rise and fall because the yeast is a living organism that's eating those sugars. It also produces CO2, and that also makes your dough rise because of the expanding gases inside of the dough.
People make some crude comparisons of what the yeast is doing to your bread to make that CO2, but I'm not going to get into that. But do you think baking soda and baking powder, and whoever came up with them and their names, I hate you. Why are they so
They're the
different
worst.
for looking the same? Anyways, Do you think someone was like, man, this yeast stuff, I need a shortcut? And that's why they produced this stuff? Or maybe they couldn't keep their yeast the way they wanted it because it can die off, it can get
So, so,
diluted.
so keep in mind, I did a ton of research on yeast, and for the longest time, starters were like handed down from generation to
Yeah,
generation,
yeah.
and people would keep them. They'd basically never die. All you got to do is throw some water and flour in it, bring it back to life, and feed it. But for the longest time, and then industrialized yeast started happening, and it had a short shelf life because it was live and it was fresh. You can buy that in the cooler section. And I think that's when baking soda and baking powder turned up because
Okay.
they were super shelf stable. They didn't need to be refrigerated. Then someone invented dry active yeast.
Yeah.
And then it kind of competes with baking soda and baking powder. So
A shout out to my buddy Pete, who also is a podcast listener, for handing down his starter to me. And that is
nice.
how I make my sourdough.
Nice. So a couple things. So when we talk, I mentioned it briefly, and then the last thing I want to talk about, and then we can maybe do my rant here in a minute, is why 350. Did you ever think about that, James?
I've never thought about that, Luke.
So pretty much every recipe you've probably ever seen, not every recipe, but the vast majority of the recipes say 350 degrees. And the reason why it's 350 degrees is all of these interesting things start to happen at 350 degrees. So at 350 degrees, all these chemical reactions start to happen. Phase change starts to happen. Liquids start turning to gas, and all kinds of things happen. So just a few degrees lower, and those things, they do happen, but they happen at a slower rate, so you don't necessarily get the lift, or we're going to talk about the Mallard Effect, the Mallard Duck Effect, I think is what it's called.
Confident that's it.
Confident that's what it is. So just changing a few degrees, like 300 to 350, is totally different for cookies, and 350 to 450 for bread is totally different. So lots and lots of things are happening. So just a couple things to think about and why you want to cook. So breads, 425 is like the minimum for a bread. You want that to be super high, get that nice crispy exterior. Pastries, 350 is pretty good for pastries. Muffins are good at 350 unless it's like a hearty muffin. You can go a little bit higher. Cookies you can do at 325, and they tend to be chewier and they don't get as crispy. And
Yeah.
do you like crispy cookies?
No,
Who likes crispy cookies?
nobody does. And if you do,
Exactly.
quit listening to our podcast.
Stop listening.
No,
So,
no,
yeah.
not that either.
Don't do that. So 325 for cookies. It'll still cook. Takes a little bit, just a hair longer, but you end up with a chewier, better cookie in the long run.
Do you know the trick of putting your cookie dough in the refrigerator for a while to get it nice and cool so they stay nice and puffy and then soft and
And if you refrigerate them overnight, there's actually a lot of chemical reactions that's
right.
happening between the eggs and whatever else you're putting in it with your flour, and it actually has richer, deeper flavors to your cookies.
I know we're not done yet with this episode, and I started out by saying people are going to tell us this has nothing to do with engineering. I think between talking about how yeast works, talking about phase change, talking about steam being a riser, this might be one of our more engineering intensive
I'm fairly
episodes.
certain it is. I'm fairly certain it is.
Awesome. Could I go back a quick step though and talk
go back
about
as much as you want.
starch? Okay.
Ooh, yeah, of course.
Starch is the carbohydrate part of the flour. So I know we kind of moved on from the flour phase, but the starch kind of gets wedged in between flour and yeast, right? Mm-hmm. So starch can do two things. And the one that Luke and I have kind of focused on here is that one of the things it can do is get broken down into sugar. And the sugar is then what our yeast friends eat up nom, 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 out of the flour and make that a magical effect that it has.
It sounds something like this. Rah, 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 rah.
If you listen to your starter, you'll hear that noise. If
You will.
it's
Fact.
it's like putting your ear up to a seashell. It can also gelatinize, which is really gross, where the starch is given a bunch of water and heat, and it swells up and explodes. And then this starch granules become the structure of the baked good that you're working with. So basically, that's all I wanted to throw in there, just to kind of fill in where does that yeast food come from.
Coolio. We doing a rant? We
Oh,
ready?
I mean, I'm ready if you're ready. Let's hear this
Okay.
week's Luke's rant.
So this week's rant is gluten-free food.
Ugh, so
So
gross.
here, well, hold on. Hear me out here, J-Bone.
Go ahead.
Here's the issue. Gluten-free food is on two ends of a spectrum. It is amazingly good because they pollute it with sugar to cover up the terrible taste.
Okay.
Or it's terribly bad because it has no flavor. The texture is weird because it's not flour. So I'm challenging those companies out there that make gluten-free goods, bread, pastries. I mean, we just sent two guys to the moon essentially in a spacecraft with an iPad for controls, and we can't make better gluten-free food. Are you kidding me, people?
I'm with you.
Here's my example. So we have a place in Pittsburgh called Gluten. It's a bakery up in Squirrel Hill, and they make the most amazing snickerdoodle gluten-free cookie. I think they lie. I think there's gluten in it because
I think that's what it is. Yeah.
But the thing is, it's got like a cup of sugar per cookie. It's amazing, but literally one cookie is like a week's worth of sugar. And then the opposite is gluten-free pizza. It's basically cardboard with like
Terrible.
Italian seasoning on it. It's either almond or it's potato, maybe. Sometimes it's rice. It's disgusting, and nothing binding it together other than eggs. So you have this egg flatbread disgusting. Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Come on, people, let's do this.
I'm with you, man. I support everything you just said there. All makes sense, and I'm gonna just put this out there because I'm tired of getting yelled at. Yes, we know we didn't send two people to the moon, but basically they went up to the space station. Settle down,
They were
people.
in space.
They're
Yeah.
they're basically there. They're a lot closer than we
Essentially.
are. Okay, what's next, Luke?
I think we have to talk a little bit about like eggs and shortening and butter
Okay.
and those sorts of things.
Let's hear it.
So I'll tackle shortening, and then if you want to maybe tackle what eggs do,
Okay.
you kind of touched on it a little bit. So shortening or fat is essential to helping the formation of gluten, because what it does when you add fat to flour and you start mixing it, it becomes hydrophobic. So that means the flour itself starts to, and hydrophobic basically repels water. And what happens is it encapsulates that gluten, and in some cases, this is why you don't add oil to bread. Some breads you do add oil to, but most breads, it's just flour, water, yeast, salt, and that's it. But when you're doing like sweet breads, a lot of times you're adding oil or butter. Booter is
Booter.
our friend Paula Dean, friend of the show.
Long-time
when she
listener.
makes her long-time listener, she puts booter and stuff. But what it does is it actually helps make things softer because it inhibits some of that gluten structure from being created, and it tends to be crumbly and softer and chewier and better and moister. So it slows the formation and helps make your product more soft and tender.
It does do that. Shortening. Just.
So this one day I made banana bread and I forgot to put the butter in it.
Ooh.
And hold on, I poked holes in the banana bread like it was like a poke cake, and then I just poured melted butter in it. It was so good. It was amazing.
You might be onto something new. Do you ever bake with lard?
When I make pie crusts.
Yes, that was a secret right there. If you're making
kinda
pie
have
crust, you have to use lard, or
And you have
else
to have ice. You
stop
have to have ice
listening.
cubes available too.
Yeah. I've really threatened a lot of people today. Like, I think everybody is going to be done listening. Okay, eggs. We mentioned that eggs keep stuff glued together. The egg yolk contains something called lipids, which I think people tell us those are bad for us sometimes. The doctors do. But then sometimes they're good for us. I don't know. Don't get me started on the egg conversation. But it's a special kind of fat that adds, like, colors and flavors to cookies. So I like anything that adds flavors to cookies. Egg whites, on the other hand, contain some other protein. Albumin, maybe?
You nailed it.
Is that right? I can't remember. I don't have it written down. But it interlocks when heated, and so it gives your thing structure again. So again, kind of that glue. So it plays a couple different roles in baking. So like flour proteins, the egg proteins kind of get all wiggly like strings and then realign into like a little knitted blanket formation again. And they make a solid out of liquid, which is what gives structure to your bake. But unlike flour, this takes heat to happen instead of just mixing it up with water. So when you toss it in the oven, that's when this sort of stuff happens.
Interesting thing about eggs.
Yeah.
The lecithin that you mentioned,
Uh-huh.
that's in the yolk, this is an emulsifier.
Okay.
So have you ever taken egg whites and you try to blend them with something and they don't blend well, and it's like oil and water separating, and it just never becomes emulsified, where it's a homogeneous solution. You can see where the egg white is and see where the water is or see where the oil is. Whenever you put the egg yolk in, so you put the whole egg in, since it's an emulsifier, it now allows both water-based liquids and fats to mingle together.
How about that? That was some more science.
That's why you do whole eggs when you're doing like sweet baked goods. If you do just egg whites to make them, they tend not to be as good.
Yeah, so egg whites, though, kind of like what you're talking about, one thing that you might be familiar with is whipping up egg whites really hard, not by hand because I'm not that good at it, but with my fancy KitchenAid, you can whip it up and allow it to fill up with air bubbles. And when you do that, if you're familiar with meringues, this is what you're doing. You're whipping it up, whipping it up, whipping up. And then if you're careful with that, you can fold that into your dough, and the air bubbles actually stay intact. If you're not careful, the air comes out and it flattens and it's ruined. So this is really one of the keys for success for like a perfect macaron. So if
Macaron.
Macaron, yes.
My daughter's taken French. She corrected me multiple times.
I'm going to reserve comments. So that's all I had to say about eggs. What are you on to next?
Last thing, I think there might be a couple more, but sugars are a big one. A lot of people think sugars are just there to make things sweet. But whenever, and I talked about that magic number of 350, when sugar reaches right around 350, it tends to break down and it starts to release those smells, that kind of nutty, burnt flavor, kind of toasty, that caramel flavor and color. You don't get that whenever you bake below 350. So if you ever do any like low temperature baking, you don't get that same taste. And if you do high temperature baking with sugar, it gets deeper and richer. So there are some pastries that you actually cook at a really high temperature, and the reason is you want to get that very nutty, toasty aroma. And this is where that Mallard effect. Yeah, the Mallard Duck reaction. And this is basically browning, and this is whenever sugars and amino acids start to combine with one another.
I know we talked about the Mallard effect before. Maybe it was when we were engineering the perfect
Steak.
turkey. Oh, the
No,
steak.
it
It was
was
the
the
steak.
steak.
I couldn't remember. Oh, yeah. And I didn't know what you were talking about then. So
Yeah.
you really taught me something yet again, Luke. Did you want to talk about anything else? Because I had one quick example that I wanted to throw out there otherwise.
So a friend of mine, Butch, told me something not a long time ago, a couple years ago, and I never believed him, but now I do. Salt is the highway to Flavortown.
Yeah, how about that?
Those of you that don't, and like when you see these baking shows and you see like this little old Italian lady making pasta sauce and she throws like a handful of salt in, you're like, oh my goodness, that's way too much salt. It's actually the right amount of salt.
Yeah, she knows
you
what she's
can't
doing.
over salt things, but again, salt is the highway to Flavortown, so make sure you're using salt in all your baked goods. Even if it's a sweet baked good, the salt helps kind of round out that flavor. So that's all I had.
I like that. That was a good addition to have in there. One thing that I wanted to call out real quick is just like something that I thought was super interesting that I saw while I was investigating this. The baking that I do is much more along the lines of cookies and cakes than bread.
I would never guess that.
We've started doing breads as well, but more cakes. So how can you ensure that you have a nice level cake? Because oftentimes you're making multi-layered cakes and they're nice and domed, and the domes are stupid, and then you have frosting that's uneven, or you have to cut it and then you cut it at an angle. Okay, so it's terrible. So how do you get nice even layers out of the oven? First, you just have to think about the physics behind that dome, right? You've mixed up your baking powder or your baking soda or whatever you're using with your flour, and your batter is all nice and even in the pan, right? It's nice and flat. How's a stupid dome get there? Well, when you think about it, the oven temperature is going to be pretty even around, but is it even on the horizontal plane? So you have to make sure that's the case. So right now, your dough is wrapped in like a hot metal container, but the
Mm-hmm.
center of the dough is not necessarily that, is not the case. So you're baking at a different speed from the outside to the inside. And so this baking and then rising is then what causes that dome to happen, which is no good if you're trying to have nice even layers. So as the pan heats up, it transmits that heat to the batter immediately adjacent to the surface of the pan. So it starts cooking on the outside faster than the inside. So what do? If you just soak some cloth, like pieces of like a pillow sheet or some sort of cloth, and wrap it around the pan, especially if you're using something like a springform pan to do this,
Mm-hmm.
it cools down that outside temperature of the pan enough so that it bakes evenly across the surface where it's touching the metal as well as the center of your cakes that you're baking, and so that when they bake they just rise evenly and give you that nice flat surface on the top instead of that dome that you then have to either cut off or try and level out with frosting. So
I
just a
started
pro
doing
tip.
this. Yeah, I started doing that about 2 years ago. And what I do is I take a piece of aluminum foil and
Uh-huh.
and I get a thing of paper towels and I wet them and I fold them so that they're the right, and I wrap it with the, so I put the wet paper towel inside the aluminum foil, fold it up, and then I wrap it around my springform pans.
Nice, we call that a hack, Luke. I like it.
The thing that you miss out though is when you slice that dome off of your cake, you crumble that up
And
and
eat it.
throw in some icing and some cream cheese and a little more sugar, and you make cake pops.
Yeah, you do get cake pops. They are a delicious treat to go along with your cake that you're already eating. I
The most
agree.
sciency show we've done in months.
I honestly believe that to be the case. If you also agree with us, or maybe you're just mad at me for yelling at you and telling you not to listen anymore, maybe you want to tell us we did a great job, maybe you want to give us some suggestions on other topics, or ask us baking questions, I don't know. Why don't you email us at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com? And until next time,
See ya.